Evanston, Friday night, November 22nd, 2019. 3 ordinary rides. One night that refused to stay stitched together. The moment he opened the door, light footsteps, breath that didn't quite fog the air, I understood the sentence that's been living in my head ever since. He walked like a memory. I drove that night because staying inside felt louder than the world outside. A month after the layoff. 2 weeks after the breakup that hollowed out the corners of my apartment. When your life goes quiet in the wrong ways, you start looking for noise you can control. Engine hum, playlist looping old instrumentals, the soft buzz of the app promising order if you follow its routes. The Toyota's interior felt familiar enough to borrow calm from. Peppermint air freshener turning slowly on the mirror. A notebook on the visor, pages warped from the cold. Heater ticking like an unsteady heartbeat. The kind of details you cling to when you're trying to convince yourself you still belong somewhere solid. Nights on the road create rituals. I checked the mirrors, twice. Ran my thumb across the stitching of the wheel. Made sure the charger glowed red. Waited for the next green ping to appear like a small, manageable universe on the map. Street lights washed the hood in broken rectangles of amber, like the city's pulse was guiding me through something I didn't know I was headed into. 3 rides, that's all it was supposed to be. 3 normal people with normal destinations. But normal breaks quietly before it collapses loudly. The first ping came at 9:56 p.m. A student, Tom, standing outside a cafe, hoodie up, backpack slouched at his feet. Harmless, forgettable. The kind of passenger you assume will talk about midterms or rent or how cold the lakefront gets after sunset. But when he climbed in, something small tilted sideways. Tom stepped into the car with a softness that didn't match the weight of his body. No shuffle of gravel under his shoes, no exhale in the cold. It felt for a split second like the night didn't react to him at all, like he hadn't disturbed the air the way people do. He gave me the destination, 3 cross streets said too carefully, and then sat in the middle back seat, hands clasped, gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. A rhythm followed him into the car. The faintest sound, almost not a sound at all, like memory brushing against fabric. That was the first tear in the night. The second ride would widen it. The third would pull it open. And by the time the last passenger arrived, I would understand why that first step he took didn't belong to this world. Why he walked like something remembered, not something living. There were small things about him that made me note. His teeth were very white, too white in the glow of my interior light. And when he smiled at the crosswalk, it felt like a paper cut, clean, precise, a slice that you register but don't bleed from.
He smelled faintly of peppermint and something industrial, like the cleaner they use on office carpets. I told myself the brain will rummage for phantom threats and find them everywhere. Still, when he leaned forward to drop a tip on the back of the seat, his hand was steady enough to leave an imprint of the knuckles on the leather, a pale rectangle like a fossil. He whistled until we reached the curb. He stepped out, briefcase in hand, gave a nod, and nothing else. The whistled 3 notes stuck with me. For the rest of the night, I caught myself in light switches and conversations, listening for those 3 notes and finding them nowhere. A week later, I would be walking to my car and hear a passing saxophonist on a corner and for a second think it was him. The memory tasted like copper. It's a stupid thing to keep thinking about, I know. But odd things lodge in drivers. You watch people disappear into doorways and the city eats them. Sometimes it returns a small thing you can't make sense of. Jason was one such return. If you want the other 2 rides, stick around. I'll get to them. The second was quieter, but it stayed with a different kind of weight. Grief shaped into a shadow rather than a scream. I picked up Leela outside a church that reeked faintly of old flowers and beeswax. Her eyes were swollen the way people who have been crying keep their eyelids, soft and raw. She had a violin case with a scuff on the corner, and a blanket folded over her knees with dog hair caught in the weave. She told me when the car was moving and the city noise had reduced her voice to more of a companionable hum that she'd seen the same old man 3 times in the pews. Not the same place, she said, not the same him. He was always sitting somewhere I hadn't looked yet. I glanced at her in the rear view, felt a small protective impatience. It's a thing you cultivate as a night driver, a soft disbelief to cushion strangers' confessions. Funerals leave people seeing things, I wanted to say. People misplace grief and project it like an old photograph onto the wrong wall. But Leela didn't sound like someone making metaphors. She described him in small details, the way his hands rested on the rail, the particular dullness of his shoes. His eyes were like glass, she said, and I could not tell whether she meant the menacing smoothness of a stranger's stare or the unseeing hard quality of someone who has been made into a memory and can no longer be changed by the world. She said she started to feel followed, but not in the way a person follows, more like a pattern of attention that traced itself through the funeral, across benches, across time. I asked the shallow things. Did you tell anyone? Did you think you were imagining it? She shook her head, folding her hands over the violin's worn edge like holding a child's hand across a table. Not everything that marks our lives is living, she said.
I keep that line in my head now, even when I try to talk it away. It isn't spooky in a cinematic way. It's the way grief takes up seat space and becomes persistent in the same way someone will always take the same chair at a kitchen table. We didn't solve anything. I dropped her at a corner near a community center where the lights were on and volunteers moved like quiet, patient machines. She stepped out and touched the violin to her shoulder like it was a warm identity. I drove away thinking about the old man. For the next few nights, I found myself checking the back seat for the weight of other people's sorrow, like it was tangible. A coat, a briefcase, a folded blanket with dog hair. Leela taught me that not every mystery has a ghost at its heart. Sometimes the uncanny is just the human brain trying to reorder loss. Those 2 stories are small weights in my pocket that I take out when the city's noise becomes too thin. They are soft, and they make me think. But the third ride was an engine with no muffler, a thing that tore open the soft seam of ordinary and left me with procedures and names and footprints in paper that I couldn't shake. The third night started like any other. Maria waved me off with a quick hand sign before she disappeared down the stairs of a diner. She is a fellow driver, older than me, and she tends to stand at corners. Username on an app, friend in a union of nocturnals. She always carries an insulated cup that leaves a ring on the hood. I remember the way she waved because it's a ritual that reassures, human acknowledgement across the flow of late-night commerce. Tom pinged at 10:12 p.m. He was a student from a campus I passed through. Quiet, a backpack with a guitar strap, the kind of passenger who apologizes for being late because everyone raised in a system of schedules cannily thinks in minutes. Alina was next, violinist, small in profile but fierce with talk about practice schedules. I dropped them both off in routine ways, small interactions that affirm the world is mostly ordinary. Then the app blinked a pickup at 11:47 p.m. under the Kennedy overpass. The map showed a little dot at the shadow where concrete swallowed the night, and I could see how the GPS tried to tidy the geometry into something readable. Underpasses in Chicago at that hour are their own ecosystems. Sodium lamps haloed in rain, the echo of a far engine, a bike chain's clatter, the smell of concrete warmed slightly by the day's remainder heat. When you drive there, you register the low hum of traffic passing above, and the pockets of silence where people sleep in their cars or stand with bottled smiles. The app named him Martin. He climbed in without preamble. He smelled like old cologne and something clean and bleach adjacent, like a hospital curtain that's been laundered too many times.
He wore a jacket that might have once been good. Now the shoulders were compressed, and there was a blanket folded on his lap that had a few specks of dog hair clinging to the fibers. He sat far back in the middle and simply said, "Drive." His voice was low. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't urgent. It was the kind of instruction that asks you to be an unremarkable instrument. The city outside moved in squares of light. For the first 10 minutes, I drove like the rest of the night had been. Eyes on the road, small glances in the rear view, the music turned down. There are rules you live by as a rideshare driver. Keep the meter rolling, respect privacy, keep small talk neutral. I followed those rules. 15 minutes into the ride, I noticed things in a sequence like steps on a staircase. First, the whistle in my head from months before, Jason's 3 notes, slipped by like an odd echo, and I told myself to stop cataloging coincidences. Then I noticed the way Martin's shoulders had shifted, lower, as if the car's movement had been too much to hold up. His eyelids were pale in the rear view. They didn't have the warmth of lids that had been rubbed and blinked recently. There was a dampness at the corner of his mouth that might have been drool. It sat there without the drama of gore, just a small, intimate sign that a body was not entirely present. I asked casually, "Everything okay back there?" No answer, just the hum of the road and the sound of the heater. I asked louder. He didn't move. I reached back without thinking. His shoulder was warm, but slack. My hand rested there and felt the way a coat filled with a person feels when the person has folded inward. There was a smell I hadn't expected. Under the cologne, a faint chemical tang, like antiseptic or the inside of a clinic. It made my mouth dry. "Sir," I said, this time with the professional cadence you rehearse for emergencies. He didn't respond. I turned in the driver's seat and said his name, Martin, out loud. Nothing. Then the present tense locks in, because some moments don't sit neatly in memory until you force them to. I open the rear door. It's colder because the car's inside air is a little pocket of warmth. The street smells of oil and wet concrete. I crouch and lean in. His head lolls at an odd angle that the seat doesn't usually permit. His jaw is slack. The corner of his mouth glistens. My fingers find his wrist. There is no answer. My thumb hunts for a pulse. Nothing beneath the skin. The feeling is a simple physics of absence. A place where motion should be turns into stillness. I check again, firmer. Still nothing. I snap my phone to 911. The dispatcher's voice on the line is blunt and contained. "Are they breathing?" she asks. I look at Martin's chest. There's a slow rise, but I can't trust the slowness anymore. "I'm not sure," I say. "I can't find a pulse." I flag the ride in the app. There is a sequence you go through with fingers that know the steps. Emergency button, flag for a medical, message for emergency response. The app gives odd comfort because it creates a paper trail. The meter keeps running because the city insists on numbers even when you are doing the most human of things. Somewhere above us, a car went by and its headlights painted our skin in a passing strip. I remember the smallness of that bright line across his face and how fragile the flash felt against the size of what was happening. I pull the door wider and set the emergency brake. I shout for help because visibility matters and because someone needs to witness what is happening. A man across the lot, Marcus, rushed over and knocked on the glass. He banged on the window until my hands shook, until the car filled with the noise of someone's attempt to prove that the world still responds when you demand it. Hey, are you okay back there?" Marcus called. He had a baseball cap and an urgency that was mouthing its own prayers. He was the kind of bystander who knows to be loud when the slow machinery of the city tends to move like it has more important things to do. I told the dispatcher we'd need an ambulance at the Kennedy underpass, and the woman on the line said they were dispatching.
Her voice was professional and too small to hold the rest of it down. Even she sounded like a person trying to be a mechanism. I put the phone on speaker because I needed both hands and because I wanted that voice in the room to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Marcus was at my window, breathless, asking if I'd called the police. I said yes. I said I'd flagged the ride. I said he'd been unresponsive for a few minutes and I couldn't find a pulse. My voice did things I hadn't expected. It went thin and precise, the tone you use when delivering facts so they can be measured later under fluorescence. Somewhere in the periphery, I thought of procedures: clear the scene, keep witnesses, protect evidence. It sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud, because here we were, two guys under a freeway with a man slumped in the back of a car, and the idea of evidence felt like a bureaucracy's attempt to hold meaning together with paper. But the app recorded the time, and the meter ticked, and the car's interior lights logged the color of the moment. I snapped a photograph, not because I wanted to commodify something tragic, but because there are rules now that require documentation, and because later on, pieces of this night would have to be stitched back together from many small parts. I dialed the app's emergency contact, Kevin, the fleet dispatcher, because sometimes it's better if the company hears it from your fingers and not from a reporter's phone. I sent a short message: unresponsive passenger, no pulse, under Kennedy, ambulance en route. I avoided words like dead because the city is oddly allergic to certainty in the moment.
Kevin's response came as a curt acknowledgement. On it. And that was both unsatisfying and necessary. He told me to stay put and wait for EMS to arrive. Practical steps. They create a map for you to follow when everything else tilts. The car filled with other sounds. Marcus's breath, the nearby whoosh of traffic passing overhead, the distant thud that might have been a bass line from a closed bar. The GPS voice announced a recalculation. My hands were damp. I thought of Maria's wave earlier, of the cup ring she'd left on the hood of her car at the corner. I thought of the peppermint air freshener swinging over the dash, and how all that domestic ordinariness could fit into the same frame as a human who no longer answered. I remember standing there and noticing small things in ridiculous detail. The way the blanket's dog hair caught the sodium light, how the vinyl of the seat had a faint spiderweb of scratches near the seam. My mind tried to inventory things as if lists were antidotes. It's a lousy defense. Lists pretend order. They don't make the world more bearable. But I made a list anyway. Pulse check, 911, app flag, Kevin notified, photo, witnesses. These were actionable priorities. They kept me from sliding into the small, fatal fog that comes when you let the imagination complete what the facts do not. A siren in the distance pitched itself into a keening. It felt like an instrument finally tuned to the right key. My heart matched that sound and then fell out of rhythm, like an engine misfiring. I stood at the open door of my car, the city's underbelly pooling around our feet, and thought, this is the night when procedures will replace small talk. This is the night that will ask the city to do the mechanical things it does when someone stops being a person and becomes a case. Paramedics are trained, and that training shows in the way they move. Quick, efficient, polite in a way that keeps their hands free. They arrived in the flash of blue and red. I watched through the windshield as they approached, as if conservation of distance made the event more bearable. Marcus stepped back, his voice falling into the hush that a crowd's arrival often draws over a scene. "Stand back," someone said. I think it was an EMT. Officer Ramirez was there soon after, a gray outline with a badge that seemed to collect light rather than throw it. He asked me my name, and I told him. He asked what happened, and I said it, the same line that now felt like a teleprompter. He took notes in a brisk utilitarian hand. He asked if anyone else had touched the passenger. I said I had, to check the pulse. He wrote it down. He asked if there were witnesses. Marcus said his name, and the way a witness says it so their voice can be pinned if needed. I let the EMTs do their work.
It's a strange experience for drivers to watch professionals convert something private into a public process.
They worked methodically, and at a certain point an officer asked if I'd like to step out of the car. The driver in me wanted to keep my seat so I could keep an eye on the evidence in the back. But the rational part of me understood that being a non-professional in the car only complicated the scene. They zipped him into a sheet and lifted him gently. A coroner, whose name would be said later, sometime in another room, cynically referred to as the person who makes the conclusion, took custody and arranged for the body to be transported. Detective Lewis would later come through with questions that felt like they were designed to make the narrative neat. Where were you? What did you see? Had you noticed anything unusual? Had he said anything? The company would email and call. A reporter named Jenna would text after a tip and ask for a statement. Those things were still in the future tense then, like a shadow of inevitables. For now, the EMTs were there, and Officer Ramirez's notebook had my name inside it. They asked me to step back, to make a place for their work. I did, and my world contracted to the spot of asphalt directly under the overpass, to the pale rectangle of light that the sodium lamp gave us. The night, in a single motion, began to feel both small and enormous. I was aware of everything. The pressure in my ears, the patience of the paramedics, the way Martin's coat folded when they lifted him, the blanket with dog hair caught like a map of something domestic and unaltered in the face of all that had happened. People take photographs with phones now at the edge of every event. Someone pointed a device, blinking like a tiny accusation, a recording that would later be trimmed and captioned and shared. I told them, quietly, that this was a police matter. No one argued. They were as stunned and as curious as the rest of us. Kevin called, through the app interface, and asked if I was okay. I told him I wasn't sure. He offered to put me on the company's counseling resource and to arrange a shift change. I said yes to all of it, mechanically, as if my body was checking boxes other people had made. The app's audit trail logged times, locations, and steps like a ledger, one that would later be used to reconstruct and to defend. They took Martin away in a white vehicle designed to be the least dramatic way to move what it must move. Detective Lewis wrote down my phone number. Officer Ramirez said he might need to speak with me again. The EMT folded up his gloves and slotted them into a pocket. Marcus leaned against the hood of my car, shaking off adrenaline like water from a coat. Later, I would learn the rest of what the night would have to offer. Texts from Jenna asking for a quote, an early blurb on a neighborhood message board with questions that smelled of outrage, a company email offering counseling, and a longer, sorrowful message from family who were eventually contacted by the coroner's office.
But those are things that happen after an ambulance drives away and leave you standing in the lee of an overpass. For now, everything stopped between two beats, the removal of the body and the arrival of someone else to tell me what I had done right and wrong. For now, I had the orange cone that the police put down and the feeling of the night folding in on itself. I had the app log on my phone and the faint taste of metal in my mouth. I had Marcus's shadow leaning against my hood and Maria's text, "Are you good?" that had come in while the EMTs worked. I remember the cold more than anything else, the way it pressed against the skin and made your thoughts crisper and unhelpfully precise. I remember the smell of the antiseptic lingering where Martin had sat, and the way the peppermint air freshener seemed both miraculous and inadequate. I remember thinking, in that small, ridiculous way people think in emergencies, about the list of things that needed to happen next. Company notification, police statement, possible tow for the car to be checked for evidence contamination, the app flag to be reviewed. They asked me for my statement. I gave it, the way you hand over a set of facts that will be folded by someone else into a narrative that may or may not match your own experience. Detective Lewis had a calm, steady voice. He asked precise questions that made me feel like an instrument being tuned. He asked where I'd picked Martin up, under the Kennedy overpass, and the exact time, 11:47 p.m. He wrote it down in letters that were neat and deliberate. That time would be a hinge in the records the city keeps for itself. GPS pings, app logs, dispatch audio. I stepped back into my car with a thin, practiced quiet that drivers learn to wear after a long night. The blanket with dog hair sat folded as if it had never known it had been a part of a trauma. The peppermint air freshener swung gently, untouched by the night's violence. I put my hands on the wheel and felt the vehicle like an animal that had been startled. I unlocked the app and watched the ride screen. End ride, confirm, submit. The sequence felt obscene and necessary. I tapped the screens that close things you don't know how else to end. Detective Lewis told me not to talk to anyone about specifics. Officer Ramirez suggested filling my report with a simple narrative and not speculating on causes. Kevin told me the company would likely put the ride under review and that their safety team would be in touch. Maria texted again, "Call me if you need anything." They left me with the odd sensation that the city had swallowed something vital and offered back a stack of documents as compensation. You can file a report, you can receive counseling, you can have the app send an automated message to your inbox with a helpline. Those are the technologies of recovery. They are useful and sterile. When I finally drove away, I took the longer route home.
The highway climbed, and for a few miles I was above the geometry of the city, and from that height the fluorescent squares shrank, and the world looked like it might reconfigure into something that made sense again. Except memory doesn't work that way. You can go upstairs and turn on the lights and think yourself renewed, but parts of your night are kept in pockets. You pull them out involuntarily later, in a checkout line or under the shower. I went home with the app's log still open on my phone, the timestamp stubbornly fixed at 11:47 p.m. under Kennedy Overpass. I put the keys in a bowl and sat for a long time on the edge of my couch, listening to the room, counting my breath. I called my mother and told her I needed to talk. Her voice was a small, warm thing on the other end, a counterweight to the city's blunt instruments. I told her the facts. She said she would come by the next morning with coffee. There's more to say about that night. There are interviews and medical records and a long, patient timeline that moves from an initial mystery to a later medical determination. There are toxicology reports that would take time and a family's grief that would not fit into any of the forms the company sent me. There is the way the neighborhood chat filled with theories faster than the coroner could deliver conclusions. There are reporters and a company public statement and a lot of small, ugly internet traffic. But those things happened in time. Right now, standing where I did under that bridge, the city had turned ordinary things into evidence and my life into an inventory list. For the next several hours, I was a person who had done the right procedural things. Call 911, flag the ride, wait. I would be asked later about other elements, whether I'd started the camera, whether the door was locked, whether I had asked Martin any questions beyond, "Are you okay?" I would be asked to remember scents and light and the way his jacket buckled. I would try to answer with the calm of someone reconstructing a movie of themselves. It is harder than you think to tell the truth of a moment when your body was doing other things. There are questions that haven't been answered yet. The search for causes, the conversations with Kevin, the detective leaning in with his notebook, the messages from Jenna asking for comment. These are the threads that pull the story outward. For now, what I keep carrying are the small sensory things. The peppermint in the air, the dog hair on the blanket, the metallic aftertaste that bled from the first story into the second and now sat heavy in my mouth after the last. People ask why we keep driving after nights like that. Part of it is necessity. The bills continue whether the night breaks you or not. Part of it is stubbornness, a refusal to let the city hollow your habits.
And part of it is something softer. Maybe I believed if I kept driving, if I kept letting the city make strangers anonymous and then return them again as tiny, unanswerable punctuations, I could learn how to carry the weight without letting it crush me. I didn't know then how long some of those threads would tangle. I didn't know that my inbox would later fill with police requests for statements. that Detective Lewis would call back with a list of times, or that Kevin would arrange a safety meeting where drivers came with their own stories to trade like talismans. I didn't know that the app would later ask whether I wanted counseling. I didn't know the medical examiner's later finding would move the event from immediate suspicion to a medical cause, or that the neighborhood would debate what it meant to be alone under a bridge at midnight. I only knew what was immediate, the pulse I couldn't find, the siren that matched my heartbeat, the smell of peppermint trying and failing to sweeten the air. And I knew there were two smaller rides tucked in my mind that kept returning to me like repeated refrains: the whistler with his 3 notes, and the woman who saw a man sitting in different pews. They felt like pieces of a sentence I was trying to read but couldn't complete. He had walked into my car and said, "Drive." For a few minutes, the city trusted me with a body that wouldn't answer. I did what I'd been trained and what felt necessary. I called 911. I flagged the ride. I waited. When the ambulance left and the overpass quieted to its ordinary hum, I sat in my car and let the hood cool. The app dinged with a notification that the ride had been flagged for review. The message was small and corporate and utterly inadequate. "We are sorry to hear about your experience." A human being would reach out. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to rest in a waiting posture that wasn't pure adrenaline. I took a breath and held it, because sometimes you hold things until they don't hurt as badly. There are more pieces to tell, names that will appear in emails, a coroner's note that will arrive after weeks, social media threads that will contort facts into fictions. There will be policy conversations and a safety meeting with Kevin and Maria and other drivers. There will be a change, small and bureaucratic, that comes from the messy intersection of human tragedy and corporate process. There will also be a memory, persistent and tactile, lodged in a pocket that I cannot empty. But for now, under the spotlight of sodium lamps and the echo of a siren that receded into the night, I drove away thinking about small mental habits. Look in the back seat. Listen for odd rhythms. Trust the app's paper trail. I drove away with the taste of 3 notes and the sentence Leela gave me: "Not everything that marks our lives is living, sitting beside me like a companion." I drove away into a city that keeps giving you ordinary things until one of them stops answering.
There is more to the night than the moment I have told you. The morning would bring messages, and the week would bring interviews, and somewhere down the line there would be a medical explanation that offered some relief and complicated grief in the same breath. But some parts of it would remain stubbornly private. The tactile memory of fingers searching for a pulse, the sound of a man banging on a window, the way the peppermint air freshener smelled like denial. If you made it this far and you want to hear what happened after the EMTs left, how the company handled the call, how the neighborhood reacted, and what the medical examiner eventually found, stay with me. The next part is the one that will change how I drive, who I trust in a back seat, and what I keep in the car for the nights I go out to clear my head. The hours after the ambulance left felt like the part of a film that gets cut for pacing. The cleanup after the stunt, the days that require forms rather than sleeplessness. I stayed until Detective Lewis finished his notes and Officer Ramirez cleared the scene. I answered the same questions in the same steady voice: where I picked him up, the exact time, 11:47 p.m., that I'd found no pulse, that I'd flagged the ride and called 911. I handed over the photograph I'd taken, because evidence is a thing the world trusts. Kevin told me to go home. Maria texted again to say the union's chat was moving and that someone would drive my next hour if I wanted. Marcus gave me his number and disappeared back into whatever evening he had been living before he ran over to hit my window. That first night after, sleep was not a thing I expected to be earned. I sat on my couch with the app's log open until the timestamp blurred into a rectangle that felt like a burn mark. Jenna, the reporter, texted within the hour with a soft, professional curiosity. "Are you available for a statement?" I told her I wasn't. The neighborhood message board, that endless fabric of outrage and neighborly devotion, filled with posts from people who lined up to sort the world into categories: someone to blame, someone to mourn, someone to fear. They used the same verbs the internet always uses: wonder, demand, speculate. I read none of it for a while. It was enough that my phone chimed and my hands shook when I opened messages. Detective Lewis called the next day, and then again the day after. His cadence made room for me to be human, and for my answers to be useful. "If you can remember anything else," he said, "call me." Officer Ramirez left me with the contact information for the officer who handled evidence. Kevin kept the chain of emails going: an HR inbox, a safety review thread, a message with a subject line that felt soulless: incident report. The company offered counseling and a paid day off. That help arrived in a bland email with a link and a number you could call at any hour. It was the correct thing and oddly insufficient at the same time.
The medical examiner's timeline was slow. Those things almost always are. There is an institutional slowness that is deliberate: autopsy, toxicology, reviews, and it stretched across weeks like a rubber band. In public, the story condensed into a few simple things: driver found unresponsive passenger, ambulance called, police took a report. In private, more complicated sentences were forming. I was told, eventually, that the medical examiner's preliminary finding was probable cardiac arrest, that later toxicology would be part of the file. The wording was careful. It had to be. In the weeks after, people filled the gap that official language left with speculation. Faces on message boards supplied motives like cheap theater. Friends offered sympathy and, occasionally, a theory. A neighbor who'd been on the wrong end of a bar fight sent me a link about stimulant overdoses. I didn't click. When the coroner's office released final paperwork, several weeks after, we learned the official phrasing I'd been told in partials: probable cardiac arrest with contributing substances noted in toxicology. That phrasing did something I hadn't expected. It did not fix the scene into a neat moral. It did not replace the man in my rear view with headlines. It made the sequence of the night more administratively whole and left the emotional mess in a separate pile I still had to carry. There were procedural things that had to be addressed. The car went in for inspection to confirm no contamination had occurred. An evidence technician photographed seams and upholstery and logged fingerprints and glove prints and the shadow of a blanket with dog hair. The app's audit trail, GPS pings, the meter's numbers, the exact minute of the flag, was printed and added to Detective Lewis's folder. Jenna ran a short piece on the neighborhood site. She quoted the police's public statement and asked gentle questions about public safety measures that the company might implement. The company, Kevin said, was in the early stages of reviewing whether an in-app emergency button should be pushed more prominently, how drivers were notified of support, and whether dash cams could be encouraged or subsidized. All sensible-sounding things. Small bureaucratic will becomes policy slowly, in meetings where people trade anecdotes like evidence. There was a safety meeting a week later at a church basement 3 neighborhoods over. Kevin, a few company safety reps, Maria, and half a dozen drivers sat around plastic folding tables. Coffee cooled in a thermos, and someone passed around store-bought muffins. People brought their own small talismans: keys with friend numbers, laminated cards with the emergency number sequence, a printout of a how-to for CPR. We talked procedure. We practiced the emergency button on the app until the motion to press it felt familiar. Someone from the union talked about peer checks, a system where drivers text each other a safe phrase at shift change and know that an unanswered line in the night calls for a knock on a vehicle. Detective Lewis stopped by and answered questions with the kind of precision that both calmed and irritated. "We need facts," he said. "We can't act on speculation." I started attending those meetings because they made the chaos feel like a thing we could measure.
They also gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing: the admission that other people's bodies had been part of nights like mine. People traded stories that were half caution and half confession. One driver spoke quietly about a passenger who slept and did not wake despite his knocks. Another told of a fight that had not escalated because he kept windows up and lights on. We traded strategies. Park in sightlines near streetlight. Keep your doors unlocked just enough to let you move. Call 911 early if you are in doubt. It was practical, and it provided ritual. Ritual steadied a frayed nerve. I installed a dash cam. It was my own small concession to the world of records. There is a comfort in literal footage that will not decay the way memory can. The red LED stares now, a tiny pulse on the dash that promises there is a loop of proof should the city ever ask for it. I didn't like the idea of constantly being recorded, but I liked the idea of evidence sitting in a hard drive if anything ever unfolded again. Kevin helped me choose one and texted instructions about how to disable audio if passengers objected. Maria helped install it on a rainy night, and we joked to thin the tension. Our jokes were quick and brittle, and they did real work. Emotionally, the upheaval lasted longer than the paperwork. I had nights of sleep that were interrupted by small noises that sounded like a door opening, or dreams where the 3 notes Jason had whistled threaded into sirens. I found myself sometimes standing in my kitchen and listening for a sound I expected to be the car's meter clicking and was not. Little things became anchors: my mother's voice on the phone, a narrow bracelet I started wearing that said "breathe" in tiny letters, the peppermint air freshener that stayed because removing it felt like an erasure. I walked different routes home for a while, avoiding the Kennedy underpass. The underpass has a geometry now in my mind that will always be mapped to 11:47 p.m. Even months later, I would pass beneath it and feel a cold, precise squeeze of memory. There was another, less tidy cost. Objectivity is a partial defense, but it does not inoculate you from the way grief folds into your own life. I started counseling. The sessions with a therapist were slow and punctuated with the small miracles everyone's therapists ask for: a quiet listening, an unpacking of things you are not terrified to speak aloud, a cataloging of symptoms.
"Night drives are full of ghosts," she said once, and meant it in the way that grief is sometimes disguised as folklore. We talked about triggers and grounding techniques. We practiced breathing that actually steadied my hands when I had to check a pulse in a hypothetical scenario. Counseling gave me language for what I had felt: intrusive images, the startled response at a bump that sounded like someone falling into the seat, a persistent sense that I might have missed an earlier sign. Talking about it didn't make the memory smaller. It gave it a shape that could be held without cutting my flesh. Kevin arranged, at my insistence, a small peer support call with Maria and 2 other drivers who'd been through medically emergent rides. The call was frank. We spoke of logistics: what to photograph, what not to touch, when to move away from the vehicle for safety, and of the quieter things: what to say to the family if they called, how to turn your phone off when you needed to stop listening to the world's questions. Maria told me about a time she had kept a passenger breathing with a belly thrust until EMS arrived. Another driver talked about calling in a friend to drive his car home because he couldn't bear to sit in it alone. These stories were not meant to horrify. They were intended to inoculate us against the isolation that arrived after trauma. The neighborhood chatter shifted slowly over the months. Early speculation softened with the coroner's report. Jenna wrote a follow-up that focused on the company's safety pilots rather than the gossipy edges of rumor. Detective Lewis asked for a follow-up interview to confirm details. He was gentle but persistent. He wanted timestamps, and he wanted to know whether I'd observed anything of obvious criminality. I told him again, no. That was an important word in his notes. Policies changed in small, useful increments. The company announced a pilot for a more prominent in-app emergency button and a voluntary dashcam subsidy for drivers who wanted one. They added a brief in-app tutorial about medical emergencies and clearer instructions for flagging a ride for investigation. There was a company memo about mental health resources, which landed awkwardly in everyone's inbox but was still something. Maria and I lobbied for better support and an actual peer check system to be available in-app, rather than a ragtag network of text messages. It takes a while for tech companies to move with urgency that matches human need, but those steps did come. The pilot would not prevent every tragedy, but it gave drivers an architecture to rely on, a place to lay their hands when their fingers wanted to do nothing. I went back to driving. Part of that was practical, bills don't wait, but part of it was practical in the sense that routine can be an act of care. I started with shorter shifts. I drove during hours when the streets had more people moving past.
I kept a small kit in my trunk now, a flashlight, nitrile gloves, a folded thermal blanket, my copy of the emergency procedures the company had sent, and the little laminated card Kevin had handed out at the meeting that listed CPR basics and the number to call on the Union line. The dash cam hummed its small red LED. The peppermint scent hung at the car's crown like a paradox, domesticity as shield. There are things I still cannot erase. When someone whistles in the back seat now, a small alert trips in my chest. The 3 notes that Jason whistled cut across the city noise in my head, and sometimes leave me listening for the cadence of them in the empty moments between exits. When someone mentions funerals, I think of Leela and her sentence about memory. When I see a folded blanket in a passenger's lap, I notice the dog hair. And yet, the thing that has changed most, quietly, then insistently, is how I talk to people in the car. I used to keep small talk minimal. Now there is a soft layer of routine inquiry that is part procedural and part human. "Are you warm enough back there?" is not merely quaint courtesy. It's an opening that can slide into, "Do you need me to call someone?" without feeling like an intrusion. I ask a small set of questions early. Name, destination, any medical concerns. Not to be creepy, but so, if the worst happens, the facts are already in the open. Months after the night under the overpass, I was invited to a company safety webinar to speak with other drivers about my experience. I hesitated. Telling the story publicly felt like re-exposing the wound. It also felt like handing someone a map to avoid walking into the same hole. I spoke about facts. 11:47 p.m., Kennedy Overpass, flag the ride, call 911. I spoke about the sensory details that mattered to me, the antiseptic tang, the dog hair on the blanket, the 3 notes that lived like copper in my mouth, and about the small behavioral changes I had adopted. Kevin promised to push more training modules into the driver's interface. Maria spoke about peer check systems. Detective Lewis listened and thanked us for being clear with our recollections. We closed with a moment of silence for the man we had all known for a few brief, impossible minutes. People sometimes ask whether I feel differently about passengers now. The honest answer is yes and no. Yes, because I am more alert to detail. No, because the city is still full of anonymous people and acts of ordinary trust. We get in each other's cars because we need to get to places that matter, and most of the time that's okay. There is a balance to be held between vigilance and paranoia. The rules we learned, the procedural checklist, are meant to let care live inside routine without letting fear run the wheel. The 3 rides I keep in my pocket are different kinds of residue. Jason's whistle is an irritation of memory, a metallic taste that sometimes catches me when I least expect it.
Leela's old man is the weight of other people's sorrow made visible, a reminder that our grief can sit in seats like another passenger. Martin, he is the one who unstitched the seam entirely for a while, who taught me the language of procedures and the ethics of documentation. He taught me how to call 911 and how to be factual even when my hands trembled.
He taught me how the city's systems, police, EMS, app protocols, could form a scaffold under an accident. He taught me, painfully, that memory is a thing you carry in your pockets like a small stone. Sometimes at night I think of that description I keep in my head. He walked like a memory. It isn't that he was ethereal, it isn't that he faded, it's that he arrived in my car with a quietness that made him partly a recollection already, as if the city had rehearsed his shape and now he appeared to fill it. There is an odd poetry in that, and a cruelty. People become memories in the most ordinary places. If there's one thing I've learned after the paperwork and the meetings and the slow unraveling of internet speculation, it's this. Document the facts, call for help early, and accept that you will need help to carry the thing afterward. Evidence matters. So do human things, therapy, friends, a union meeting in a church basement with coffee gone cold. We are not machines. Memory lives in our bodies and will make shapes of its own. Let it. Name what you can and let people help you handle the rest. I still keep the peppermint air freshener. I installed the dash cam. I answered Detective Lewis's follow-up calls. Kevin and Maria and I pushed for the emergency button pilot to be more visible. I returned to the underpass months later on a day that felt like a small test. The sodium lights were the same. The geometry of concrete arches pressed the same shadows. The city hummed with the same indifferent kindness. I stopped the car for a second and breathed. The red LED on the dashcam blinked. The city waited for me to move. If you've ever had a ride that left you with a single sentence in your mouth, an image, a sound, a quick fear, write it in one line in the comments. Share one sentence. We are a collection of small testimonies in a city that tends to anonymize everything in motion. If you can, subscribe for more true accounts like this. We tell them so others can learn the procedures and the soft rules to keep each other safe. He walked like a memory, and for a few minutes the city trusted me with that memory. I drove away with a list, a peppermint scent, and a small red light blinking on the dash. I still carry him in a pocket I cannot empty, and I keep driving because that is what you do when the world asks you to keep going.